proportionally the way that it should be. So I have a 4x8 sheet of plywood that I put on the dining table, and I found wide paper, and I start again doing smaller units, enlarging those into the large unit, and then tracing it onto fabric. I do it all in pencil first to make sure that it's correct, and then I go back and I ink it in. So it's all a hand process, nothing by computers. Sometimes, one time one person asked me how I did all this, and I said, well, I do a lot of cut and paste. They said, oh, you must be a whiz at the computer. I said, no, I take scissors and cut it out and paste it on the paper with glue.
They didn't understand. Right. That's funny.
But one other thing there, you asked me about teaching. Yeah. When I teach, I really like to concentrate on basic techniques. A lot of people out there teach special techniques. They teach their new pattern. But I think unless you know the basics of any shape that you're doing, then there's a problem of having frustration after that. But if you learn the basics, you can do anything then.
How do you feel about, so have you ever had experiences where you've designed something and then you saw somebody else had taken your design, or does that not happen in the field? Do you have people that copy your work?
It has not happened often. Back in the early days, I did an introductory thing at a convention, and I showed a very simple thing. And that same year, I was at a convention in another state, and I went down the escalator, and at the bottom was a vendor, and I had a pattern of my design. I said, oh, that looks like mine. She said, oh, yes, I saw yours, and I copied it and made a pattern. Now, this was just simple squares and triangles put together. But since then, I've really not ever, been aware of it. Because there are a lot of shapes that are basically in public domain. Mm-hmm. And unless you have some really unique thing about how the shape is put together, it's hard to say that it was copied.
That's interesting. So when you make the big queen size whole cloth on the big board in your living room, in your dining room, where do you begin? Do you begin in the middle, or do you begin towards the edges? Do you have a sort of strategy of how? It seems very daunting to have a big piece of paper in front of you like that.
Okay, the first thing is I will put the paper down and determine what the size of the individual units are. For instance, the overall size will be a certain amount. Of that, say 12 to 15 inches will be border. So I then draw the border in, and then I know approximately what the center medallion may be. So those are the first things that you do. I do an outline of that on the paper. Now, each of those units have already been drawn in their small increments. For instance, in a border, you have a corner, which is distinctive, and then you have a long section of some kind of repeat motif, which comes down to the center point. If it's a design that is a one-directional design, and you're going to flip it and do the other. So, and then even in the center motif, if it's round or if it's square, I've only drawn whatever that wedge is, 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch for that. So I've already done small pieces, small units, then that are brought to the bigger piece and just simply traced.
Interesting. So do you use, since your daughter we're going to talk to your daughter in the next hour, do you use stencils or do you hand draw when you're doing the whole cloth?
Sometimes I use stencils. In fact, one of the newest designs I've done, the border started with just a standard stencil. It was a meandering, wavy, curved feather stencil. And that was the basic, but I pulled out of that certain sections and motifs to create a more elaborate corner. And also at that halfway point, I elongated and elaborated on it so that I would have a good turning point. So sometimes I will start with a stencil. Usually is a very common design. Other times I would have created a shape. In fact, I have a stencil that's just two sizes of kind of a fancy S that I use a lot in creating these designs. So the answer is yes. If there's something there that I can use as a stepping off point, certainly I can use it and not have to create it from scratch, as you say.
Let me ask you one more question, and we'll move on. So when you have a quilt, not a whole cloth, but a quilt, what is your strategy for thinking through the quilt design with the quilt? Are you working with the shapes? Are you planning all of it? Sort of, what's your sort of strategy for? And are you thinking about the design of the quilting as you're piecing, or does it come after you've pieced it? Sort of, what's your thoughts about that?
Okay, I usually don't think too much about it while I'm actually putting the pieces together. However, when I start actually piecing it, in other words, I don't have the piecing design and the quilting design in mind when I start the process. But I'm in the process of piecing it, and I start seeing the blocks develop and merge into a larger unit. I start thinking about how will I quilt this? What motif lends itself? For instance, I just finished piecing a large quilt that's based on the disappearing nine patch, which is very popular now. And all the way through I was doing that, I was saying, how will I do this? And by the time I finished, it was pretty much focused in my mind what I would do. There's a lot of straight machine quilt. It's going to be machine quilted. There's a lot of straight lines in it. And then there's one block that I suddenly said, because of the color, this requires a leaf. So I folded my paper, I drew a leaf, and that will then become the quilting motif in that particular section. So I urge people not to focus too much on it until they get the whole thing done, and then start looking at it and see, what does it look here? And then the second thing, is there a commercial stencil available that I might use here, or is it something that I'm going to have to create myself?
Do you see the quilting as complementary to what you're doing? It sounds like that's what you just said. Like, are you thinking about like the whole design? Like, is it separate? Is it what's your strategy in terms of what the quilting should be adding to the pieced top? Okay.
The quilting motif should be complementary to your background. There should be sufficient amount of quilting on the total piece that will give a unified effect to the finished quilt. In other words, there should not be large unquilted spaces, so that you have the two layers that have to go together into the one. And then the other thing that I say is that whatever you put on there, in order to achieve that unity, should be large, should be the size so that it will fill the space without crowding. Those are basically the three things that I say. And filling the space without crowding also will provide that unifying effect. And the unifying effect of both elements, the quilting and the whatever it's on, is not only for looks, but it's for stability. Mm-hmm. If you have a quilt that's going to be heavily used and washed, then you need to put more quilting on it for the stability issue. If you're going to have a piece that's going to hang on the wall, if you don't have sufficient quilting to hold it all together in a uniform way, well, then it's going to droop. I don't care what you do about it. In time, it's going to shift. So I think you have to look at both of those elements in order to produce the final unified look of the quilt.
Interesting. So I've been trying to quilt every night and practice free motion quilting every night. And I'm starting to believe that I'm not sure if I'll ever master any of it. So I'm wondering is it an art or is it a skill? Do you think that if you just work hard enough, it looks pretty? Or do you think that there is a sort of artistic element like handwriting that not everybody can make beautiful quilts? It isn't just about time, putting in the time.
I think to focus too much on art will prevent one from developing the skill and the love. So I'm a firm believer in learning the technique. Work with simple shapes in a way that's pleasing to you. And as you develop comfort in those skills, I think then you will branch out into whatever style you prefer.
Yeah.
There's some people who only want a piece. There are others who enjoy the applique. There are others that enjoy the art. I read on the internet too many people, especially beginner quilting, they get too hung up on, is my color right? Are these shapes right? Is my border the right size? So they're too involved with those kinds of things rather than concentrating on the workmanship.
Yeah. Well, that's nice to hear. I think I will follow that philosophy. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I want to learn more about judging quilts, which you have done, and then a few other things that you've been involved with. But tell me about how you got involved with judging and what is it to be part of the National Quilt Association? What does it mean to be a judge of quilting?
Okay. First, I have to say that the organization that established the first judging certification program was the old National Quilting Association. I was the second person to be certified back in the mid-1970s. And, of course, kept up that certification since then. And then when National Quilting Association discontinued, we have the new National Association of Certified Quilt Judges. There's a lot of misconception, I think, about what judges are and what they do. We technically work for the organization for whom we are judging. But certification prepares you with skills in order to adequately do that without prejudice. What we look at and the reality of judging is we don't have much time to spend critiquing the quilt because of the quantity that the group has and the length of time that we have to do it. So we have to be able to very quickly judge the overall appearance of the quilt. That's one of the items that in every quilt judging process has. What is the appearance? How does it look? Does it hang straight? is there pet hair on it?